Grab your Bibles this morning, and we are going to be starting our series today in the book of 1 Timothy. But to start our study into 1 Timothy, we need to make one important stop before we go in, and that is going to be 1 Corinthians chapter 3. So 1 Corinthians chapter 3, and today we have nothing up on the screens. We had some issues with tech, and I'll just leave it at that. We'll have it fixed sometime soon. So you got your note sheets if you want to follow along. August 2007. August 1st it was. In Minneapolis, it was just another day. Probably for you, it was just another day. August 1st, 2007, you probably don't know what you were doing. But August 1st, 2007 in Minneapolis, thousands of people were making their way home after work in the daily grind, bumper-to-bumper traffic that is around Minneapolis. And I can tell you it's not fun. But at 6:05 p.m., the I-35 Mississippi River Bridge collapsed in the middle of rush hour traffic. 100 vehicles, 18 construction workers fell up to 115 feet into the river and onto the banks below. November 13th, 2008, the NTSB released their findings for its investigation. Why did the bridge collapse? Well, the primary cause of the collapse was undersized gusset plates that hold things together. They weren't the right size. Contributing to that design flaw was the fact that over the years, 2 inches of concrete had been added to the bridge so it could repair the roadway, which added a dead load of 20% to the bridge. And on top of that, while the bridge was actually being repaired at the moment, the construction workers had unwittingly staged all of their equipment and materials over the weakest points of the bridge. What do we see in this? Like we have a bridge. It lasted for decades. But one wrong calculation by an architect out of 1 million right calculations, right? Plenty of right calculations, one wrong calculation. What hundreds of acts of frugal maintenance done to keep the bridge in service. And one accidental oversight in the middle of repair led to a catastrophic failure and loss of life 40 years after the bridge had been built. And here's the link. What's true in the world of construction is in many ways true for the church. Which is why I want to open up our series in 1 Timothy today with a question that's going to logically precede everything that Paul is going to lay out for us. A question. And the question is simply this: do our methods really matter to God? Do our methods really matter? Maybe to put it another way, if our methods are bringing people into the church and helping them feel like they have somehow connected with God, isn't that a sign that God is blessing what we're doing and that He's happy? Well, if we were dealing with any other organization, the answer would most likely be yes. But the church is different for at least 3 reasons. The church is the only institution on the face of this planet that has been entrusted by God with the message of repentance and sins and belief in Jesus Christ for forgiveness and everlasting life. Only institution. Number 2, as we're going to see it going through 1 Timothy, God has given us a blueprint to follow. That we might know what a healthy church is and how He wants us to build it. God has a lot to say about what the church looks like and what it does. And number 3, as we're going to see in our text today, God goes out of His way to warn us that any departure from His plan will lead to nothing but present and certainly eternal futility. What this means is that our church and any church, a church cannot be defined by the personality or preferences of its pastors or of its elders or of its long-term church members. You know, like a Fortune 500 company or a nonprofit organization is often defined by their current CEO or their board of directors or maybe some of those deep, long-holding stakeholders. It doesn't work like that. And that's because the church doesn't belong to me. It doesn't belong to your elders. And even though we have done a lot recently to elevate the importance of church membership, it doesn't ultimately belong to the church members as well. It belongs to God. And He's going to thoroughly assess the work that is done on the final day. God will assess the faithfulness of His church. And we see this. We see this in 1 Corinthians. And once we grasp this passage, it causes us to look at the church through different lens, which is why I want to start in our study in 1 Timothy here. Verse 1 of chapter 3. But brothers, I couldn't address you as spiritual people, but as people of the flesh, as infants in Christ. I fed you with milk, not solid food, for you weren't ready for it, and even now you're really not ready. For you're still of the flesh, for while there is jealousy and strife among you, are you not of the flesh and behaving only in a human way? For when one says, I follow Paul, and another says, I follow Apollos, are you not merely being human? I mean, it's clear when we get to this text, like Paul is hot. He is not very pleased. And as we read it, it's also clear that Paul isn't ultimately focused on himself. He's focused on this persistent immaturity in his former congregation. Notice in verse 1, their immaturity wasn't surprising at the beginning because he planted the church. He's like, it makes sense. You were baby Christians. They were infants in the faith, so he gave them milk, the simple basic. He gave them discipleship 101. It's what they needed, and it was right. But the catastrophic problem, according to Paul, is that while they had transitioned from the initial teachings of Christianity, we might call them milk, to broader instructions, the solid food, and this isn't like just deep esoteric doctrines. This is like, what does it mean to live as a Christian? They weren't maturing in their faith. I mean, to put it in the most basic terms, kind of like an example we could all understand. Everybody expects their babies to act like babies, right? There is one rule in life, right? Babies are going to be babies. But nobody expects their teenagers to act like 2-year-olds, right? I don't want my teenager eating like a 2-year-old, talking like a 2-year-old, doing anything like a 2-year-old. They're a teenager. And that's kind of like what's going on in this church. They should be teenagers. Not perfect, but they're not. The sad truth is this is all too common in churches today. Believers that never make it past the baby stage. But what happens when Christians remain in this stage? Well, the simple answer is nothing good. And in Corinth, it's a letter full of problems, if you're familiar with 1 Corinthians. It's chocked full of problems. And the problem that we want to look at here is in chapter 3 is ignorant conflict. Ignorant conflict is going on in the church. And I've chosen the adjective ignorant because this conflict should not be happening. It's actually a demonstration that they're immature, which is Paul's point. The very fact that they're fighting over Paul and Apollos, two different ministers, is evidence that they are immature. From what we can tell, the story goes something like this. Sometime after Paul left Corinth, and he continued his missionary work, Apollos came in to the fellowship, and he grew up in the ranks, and he started to assume leadership and teaching responsibilities, and he was having an awesome impact in the church. Good things were happening from the ministry of Apollos. But the problem was that the church members began to compare the ministries of Paul and Apollos. And they said, well, Paul really didn't teach anything deep. He just taught shallow stuff. But Apollos, dude, he teaches deep truth. Man, he's so much better than Paul. Like, why didn't we get him in the first place? Even more, like Apollos' rhetoric and his ability as a speaker was even more polished. So everything just came off smooth. And as a result, the church broke into these competing factions over their favorite pastor, Paul or Apollos. But it's interesting as we read Paul here. Because Paul doesn't write in his letter, like, what in the world are you doing? I'm an apostle. He's not an apostle. No, he doesn't say, I'm an apostle, I'm more important. He doesn't do that. No, he actually does everything he can to level the playing field between him and Apollos. He wants them to see that they're laborers, they're co-laborers, they're not competitors. God's servants and pastors are co-laborers, they're not competitors. Picking up in verse 5. What then is Apollos? What is Paul? Servants through whom you believed, as the Lord assigned to each task. I planted, Apollos watered, God gave the growth. So neither he nor he who plants nor he who waters is anything, but only God who gives the growth. He who plants and he who waters are one, and each will receive his wages according to his labor. For we are God's fellow workers. You are God's field, God's building. First thing I want to do here in verse 5 is kind of right-click on this word servant. Because it underscores the fact that Paul and Apollos, once again, they're not real rivals. They're not religious entrepreneurs. Like putting their own spin on Christianity. No, they're the same thing. They're servants. They're servants of God. Yes, Paul may be an apostle, but he says, Apollos and I are the same thing. We're servants. This word here, servant, isn't slave, but it's actually the word that we get deacon from, and it means agent, intermediary, or courier. What does he want the church to see? Paul and Apollos are the same thing. We are God's representatives to you. So we are. And as God's servants, we have been assigned, right there in the text, assigned by God to a specific location to fulfill the tasks that they've been assigned. So we belong to God, we're his representatives, and we go where God tells us to do. We go where he tells us to go and do what he tells us to do. And to illustrate this, he turns to the world of agriculture. He looks at the farmer's field. And if you think about the farmer's field for a minute, I mean, to my knowledge, I've never grown up in farming. Maybe some of you have. But I don't think anybody ever praises a farmer's plowing or planting technique. Like there's cheerleaders on the side, woo, right? I don't think anybody praises their weeding and watering techniques. No, if there's any celebration for a farmer, when does the celebration happen? It's at the harvest. Like, what matters? All that work is going to one end. The plowing matters because it gets a harvest. The watering and weeding matters because it helps us get the harvest. What do we celebrate? We celebrate the harvest. But even more as we look at Paul's illustration, he doesn't envision a single farmer, does he? He doesn't envision a single farmer, but multiple farmers, multiple servants working their assigned duties at different stages of the field. Like one guy, it's his job, plow. He's the plow dude. We got another guy, he's the plant dude. We got another guy, he's the watering guy. That's Paul's illustration. But the key thing is their assigned tasks are complementary, right? They all work together. They don't work against each other. In fact, if we miss one of the stages, we can have serious problems, right? You don't plow and you just walk out there and throw seed on the ground, it's probably not going to do very much. Birds are probably going to get a good meal. How about you plow and you plant, but you decide, you know what, I'm going to conserve water. Probably not going to get much of a harvest because there's not any water to actually cause it to grow. See, this is what he wants us to see. How do God's servants work together over time as co-laborers? Necessary, important parts, each pastor, each church leader working in different ways. And as we're going through here, I don't want you to just be thinking pastors alone. This is like pastors, elders, and includes those who are involved in significant ministries in the church. But here's the key. Who makes it grow in verse 7? God makes it grow. God sends his servants to do the work. Their work is important, but when it comes down to it, there's a harvest because God causes it. Psalm 127, verse 1. Unless the Lord builds the house, the builders labor in vain. Unless the Lord watches over the city, the guards stand watch in vain. It's Proverbs 21, starting in verse 30. There's no wisdom, no insight, no plan that can succeed against the Lord. The horse is made ready for the day of battle, but the victory rests with the Lord. God gives the harvest, while God uses people in his service. The harvest is his. So what do we see in this metaphor? Once again, we see the church doesn't belong to the pastor. The church doesn't exist for the pastor's ego or self-expression. The pastors and elders and other leaders exist for the sake of the church. Second thing we see here is that church leaders are co-laborers, not competitors. At every stage of ministry in the church, no matter what we're doing together, our goal is not to be competing against each other in anything that we're doing, making our ministry that we're involved in somehow stand out against everybody else's. Everybody look at me. Like, we want people serving in their areas because they love to serve Jesus and they love the impact it has in the church, but not using it as a way to find a spotlight for themselves. Because when it comes down to it, whatever truly comes out of our ministries that has lasting spiritual significance is from God's grace and a product of his power by the Holy Spirit. It's his. And at this point, we might be tempted to think, well, okay, if God, we do our work, but God's the one that ultimately does the work. I mean, we can bring in some other passages. Okay, well, Jesus promised the gates of hell wouldn't overtake his church. We might be tempted to think, well, as long as we're doing things out of a good heart, to follow God and to lead in his church, as long as I have good ambitions and good intentions, isn't that okay? Isn't it enough? I mean, like, whatever we're doing, I have a good heart and a good desire, God will certainly bless it, won't he? And our answer to that is actually no, that we're going to see here in the text. Because God's pastors, his leaders, are required to follow his blueprint, not their own designs. The church isn't something to be recreated by each pastor leading it into something new and creative. 1 Corinthians chapter 3, starting verse 10. According to the grace of God given to me, like a skilled master builder, I laid a foundation and someone else is building on it. Let each one take care how he builds upon it, for no one can lay a foundation other than that which is laid, which is Jesus Christ. Now, if anyone builds on this foundation with gold, silver, precious stones, wood, hay, and straw, each one's work will become manifest, for that day will disclose it, because it will be revealed by fire, and the fire will test what sort of work each one has done. If the work that anyone has built on the foundation survives, he'll receive a reward. If anyone's work is burned up, he will suffer loss, though he himself will be saved, but only as by fire. Now, I wouldn't be surprised if at least one or two of you might be wondering why I'm using this passage to talk about ministry in the local church. Because you've probably heard it used to encourage believers to keep growing in their Christian life. Right? Keep growing. God's going to test what you build. Now, in the big picture, is it true? Will believers stand before Jesus Christ on the final day, not with this worry that they might suffer eternal wrath, but stand before him to answer for their lives and what they've done? We know that answer is yes. Believers will stand. James declared that very same truth in James chapter 5. Believers will stand, not for judgment, but he will assess our work. But here Paul isn't warning individual Christians about personal rewards at the judgment seat of Christ. He's actually warning them about judging their pastor's ministry skills by worldly standards, right? That's where this entire passage started. It's about measuring their pastors by worldly standards, things like charisma, creativity, rhetorical skill, personal appearance, anything else you can put in the pile. That was the problem. That's the problem he's still addressing. Well, let me show you what I mean as we examine the immediate context of our passage beginning in verse 9. Notice what does Paul say? We are God's fellow workers. Who are the we? Paul and Apollos. He hasn't left the comparison contrast between him and Apollos. And now he turns to the church and he says, you are what? You are God's field. You are God's building. Okay, so the workers are Paul and Apollos, and the field and the building are God's people, the church. In fact, when we look at you are God's field, God's building, the you there is actually second person plural in the Greek. And if that doesn't mean anything to you, you've probably heard at least one Southerner in your life say y'all. Okay, that's what the you there is, y'all. So he's saying on the one hand, he's saying we, Apollos and I, are God's fellow workers. Y'all are the field and the building. Okay? So if we apply this quickly to the church, we could say that the pastors and the elders of the church, whether former or current, have been fellow workers. Fellow workers throughout the history of the church. And that you all here, this congregation, you're God's field, you're God's building. Let me get to verse 10. According to the grace of God given to me, like a skilled master builder, I laid a foundation, and someone else is building on it. Let each one take care how he builds on it. So now that we get the division between Paul and Apollos and the church, Paul says, now I'm a skilled master builder, I laid the foundation, and another person is building on it. Who's the other person we have in the text? Apollos. I did the foundation, Apollos is building on it. Just like the farm hands who served at different stages in the field. And it seems like Paul here is transitioning from the field to the building because it's possible in a smaller field for one farmer to do all the work from planting to harvest, right? Everybody's had their hobby garden. They do all the work in it. Nobody else comes in and does it. You do it, right? But large buildings in the ancient world, like one person did not build them. They required hundreds of workers, sometimes thousands of workers for multiple years. I mean, Khufu's pyramid in Egypt took 20 years. The temple to Artemis in Ephesus took 120 years. Herod's temple took 46 years, and the Colosseum in Rome took 10 years. Hundreds and hundreds of people at work. In fact, when we see this, we also recognize that Paul is moving past him and Apollos in verses 12 through 15 to lay down a principle for the church of every age. When he transitions from we, that is Paul and Apollos, to anyone. Verse 12, now if anyone builds on the foundation, he's now making an application. Anyone builds on the foundation with gold, silver, and precious stones, wood, hay, and straw, each one's work will become manifest, For the day will disclose it, because it will be revealed by fire, and the fire will test what sort of work each has done. If the work that anyone has built on the foundation survives, he'll receive a reward. If anyone's work is burnt up, he will suffer loss, though he himself will be saved, but only through fire. It starts to change this verse when you realize that the focal point is on pastors and elders and those key leaders in the church. Whose work is going to be assessed here? Those who are leading the church. Therefore, the wood, hay, and the straw in these verses is not individual sins of individual Christians. It's actually man-centered, pragmatic methods of church leadership. Pragmatic ways to go about leading the church. We want to draw big crowds. We want to have quick, observable results. We want to focus on the skills and abilities and rhetorical prowess of a pastor instead of verifying the content of what they're actually teaching. Wood, hay, and stubble. I mean, if you think about it, when you're building, just to stay in the building metaphor for a minute, if we want to kind of compare how easy it is to build something big if you're working with wood or bales of hay and straw, or you're working with gold and silver and precious stones. I mean, if we're just thinking size-wise, which gets bigger quicker, right? Like wood, hay, and straw, man, it can get big quick. It takes a lot of skill, a lot of time, a lot of effort to work with gold and silver and precious stones. But if we're just looking at external appearances, we can see things get large. We can see things grow and be convinced that it must be some awesome thing. You know, and often we see in our day and age, we see ministry leaders employ inferior messages which are much more like wood, hay, and stubble, and all of a sudden they're selling best-selling books and headlining conferences. But what's the problem? God's blueprint never calls for cheap filler. It calls for the kind of costly materials, gold and silver and precious stones, that match the foundation. I think some of you know that my dad was an auto body guy. Did it all his life. He worked in shops for like Chevrolet and worked in a private dealer. And then back in the late 70s, this place called the Skill Center opened up, which is now called West Sound Tech. You probably have heard of that. He launched the auto body program at what's now West Sound Tech. And back in the day, they were doing crazy stuff. Like they were cutting entire cars apart and putting them together, straightening frames. He had kids go off, like one built cars for one of the guys from ZZ Top. Like they turned out some pretty nice stuff. And it was really hard, though, having that man as my dad. Because when I was in high school, I wanted a nice car, right? And every nice car that I could find that was in my price range, we would go look at. Dad, there's a Chevelle, Camaro, Mustang, right? I mean, come on, it was the mid-'80s. They were still out there for reasonable prices. There'd be something. We'd go find it. We'd go take a look at it. And it would look good on the outside. I'm like, oh, man. He'd walk over and be like, dude, this entire quarter panel is nothing but Bondo. Feel up on the inside, they never even took out the dent. You know, it's like, look at this, like nothing lines up on the car. All the lines are out of whack. Look up underneath. Oh, look at that frame horn. It's twisted over still. Okay, thanks, Dad. You know, like what did I end up with? A Chevy Chevette. I'm not kidding. It was painful. But it was my dad's job. It's what he did. He knew what to look for. He could see it like that. And it was for my good. I didn't need to be driving a pile of garbage that I'd be unhappy with and find problems with. God sees our church like that. And there's times that in our humanness, there's any number of things that we go, yeah, that's it. That's the ticket. But from God's perspective, it's just Bondo in a big dented quarter panel with a little bit of paint over the top. It's not what He has called us to do. See, church, this is the constant pressure in church ministry. We want to see results because we want to bring honor and glory to God. But our ministry labors, no matter how hard we work, don't instantly equate into observable results. In ministry, you can't put in, labor at a level, we'll just call it 100 and expect, maybe let's just call it half, a 50 result, right? No, there's times we put in 100 and we're not even sure if anything's coming out. Like we're working and we don't see it. It takes time. And as a result, we're tempted to believe. We might never articulate it quite this clearly, but we might be tempted to believe that we just live in a day where God's plan doesn't work very well anymore. That was 2,000 years ago. We need something that fits this day and age. We need to change it up. But anytime we walk away from God's blueprint, our methods will inevitably fall short. Charles Spurgeon warned us about this over 100 years ago. In some very telling words, he says this: if you have to give a carnival to get people to come to church, then you will have to keep giving carnivals to keep them coming back. If that's what it takes to get people in the door, if you got to ramp it up so high and heavy to get them to come in, you're going to have to maintain that to keep them. When what are we called to do as a church to be here? We're called here to worship God. God is the center, not us. See, there's a kind of growth and a kind of success that is not from God and it doesn't bring Him glory. And it's one of the reasons why I want to go into this study in 1 Timothy. It just seems like it's a good place at our church to talk about heavier things in ministry and answer a lot of questions that are actually coming at us from our culture. There's a lot of things in our culture today that come right out of 1 Timothy and help us understand how to answer it. But as we go through it, we might find that here and there, that there may be some cherished approaches to church ministry that are popular in our day and age that Paul might expose as nothing but filler. We'll have to see that as we go along, but it's something we need to be ready for. That how can we know the difference between the cheap filler and those costly materials? I think that's what we all want to know. How do we know the difference? If God's going to judge everything that your pastors and leaders do in this church, how do we know what to do? How do we know the materials to use? Well, he lays it out for us, many of them, in this extended book of 1 Timothy. There's other places we can go. But God tells us. We don't have to guess. We don't have to guess. He gives them to us. In fact, we see this in Paul's purpose statement in 1 Timothy 3, verses 14 through 15. Really kind of like, what's Paul's purpose in the book that we're going to be starting this next week? He says, I hope to come to you soon. But I'm writing these things to you so that if I delay, you may know how one ought to behave in the household of God. Behave, that's not just behave as and interact with each other only, but that's how to worship. What are we supposed to do? What are we supposed to prioritize? How do we interact with one another? How are you supposed to behave in the church of the living God, which is the pillar and buttress of the truth? Because in many ways, Timothy had things maybe even harder than Apollos in Corinth. Because Paul planted a church in Ephesus, just like in Corinth. This letter in 1 Timothy, it's written to Timothy. He's in Ephesus. And just like Corinth, Paul had to keep moving on after he planted the church. And Paul knew there was a number of problems in that church in Ephesus. He was well aware of them. So he left his closest friend and partner of ministry, Timothy, behind to straighten things out. I mean, if you want to do a good study sometime, look at everywhere Paul sent Timothy to get information, to straighten things out, and to make it happen. Man, Timothy was his right-hand man. Anyway, sometime shortly after Paul leaves Timothy behind, he sends him this very letter to help Timothy know how to shepherd this very dysfunctional church. And there's 6 key tasks that he lays out for Timothy. 6. I'll move through them kind of quickly. 6 tasks that we're going to see that Timothy has to do. Number 1, protect the truth. Protect the truth. That's where the book opens up. Timothy, protect the truth. Then Paul's going to transition in chapter 2, and he's going to call Timothy to purify corporate worship. There's problems going on in worship in the church. They need to be straightened out. It even intersects with questions in our church today about gender roles in leadership of the church. It's addressed, chapter 2. Chapter 3, he's called to establish qualified leaders. Why does the church have problems? It needs to have more qualified leaders leading the church to help lead across all arenas. Timothy can't do it by himself. He needs other men serving along with him. 4th thing, we'll move through these next 3 quickly. Practice true godliness. Not just those things that appear to be godly. Number 5, foster gospel-centered relationships. There's multiple relationships in the church, various people groups to have to navigate, and he talks about those. And then finally, he calls Timothy to pursue contentment in Jesus Christ alone. See, church, our ministry methods matter to God. Our methods of ministry matter to God. He's given us countless instructions in His Word, and on the final day, He will hold your pastors and your elders or any other significant ministry leader accountable for the nature of their work on your behalf. That's 1 Corinthians chapter 3. In fact, as we're closing this morning, I want to be clear. I'm not saying, as we go through this study, that we never want to be creative, we never are going to consider results, and that we're not going to be afraid of trying something new. Nor am I trying to imply that somehow big churches are unfaithful churches. Please hear that. Rather, I'm saying I want us to do everything we can to follow God's plan. Is it something new? Great. Is it creative? Great. How does it follow the plan? That's the question. Not just is it new. How does it follow the plan? Because at the end of the day, we have a promise, one way or another. As we follow God's plan, God brings a harvest. God does work as we follow His word. See, the main idea of this morning is this. And it leads us into our study that will begin next week, a healthy church. A healthy church is not the product of man's design. In fact, we could say it's never the product of man's design, but God's grace as His people follow His blueprint that He's given us in the Bible. And that's going to be the study that we're going to have from this next week until about the end of summer as we work our way through the book of 1 Timothy. Let's close in a word of prayer.